Welcome to Module 2. Throughout this course, we've explored several important ideas. We have examined educational policy, we have discussed educational governance, we have also looked at different levels of educational systems and the ways decisions move across those levels. But a question still remains: how do all these pieces fit together? Educational systems are complex. Policy influences governance, governance influences practice, practice shapes outcomes, culture influences how policies are interpreted and enacted. Different actors bring different interests, responsibilities, and perspectives. Yet these elements are often examined separately. Researchers may focus on policy without considering governance. Leaders may focus on implementation without examining culture. Organizations may focus on outcomes without understanding the processes that produce them. When we look at only one piece of the puzzle, we risk missing important connections. We may understand individual parts of the system, but not how those parts interact. This is why another framework is needed. HEPGA was developed to help us move beyond fragmented analysis and toward a more holistic understanding of educational systems. Rather than focusing on a single element, HEPGA encourages us to examine the relationships among policy, governance, actors, processes, practice, culture, and outcomes. In other words, HEPGA helps us see the whole picture. If educational systems are often examined in fragmented ways, what are the limitations of that approach? Let us explore why studying policy, governance, culture, or outcomes in isolation can lead to an incomplete understanding of educational change. This slide introduces the central idea behind HEPGA. On the left side of the slide, we see what HEPGA refers to as fragmented analysis. In educational research and practice, it is common to examine one part of the system at a time. For example, we might focus only on government policy, only on leadership and governance, only on classroom practices, or only on culture. Each of these perspectives can provide valuable insights. However, when they are examined in isolation, they provide only a partial understanding of what is happening in an educational system. As shown here, the different elements are disconnected from one another. Macro policy is separated from meso-governance, micro-level realities are separated from culture, informal practices and shadow policies are treated as independent issues. The result is a fragmented picture of education. We understand the pieces, but we miss the relationships between them. This is where HEPGA offers a different perspective. At the center of the slide, the arrow represents a shift in thinking. Instead of studying educational issues as separate parts, HEPGA encourages us to examine how these parts interact and influence one another. On the right side of the slide, we see a holistic analysis. Here, macro, meso, and micro levels are connected. Culture is connected to policy and governance. Shadow policies and informal practices are connected to everyday educational realities, and all of these elements interact within a larger educational system. The key idea is that educational outcomes are rarely produced by a single factor. They emerge from the interaction of policies, governance structures, organizational cultures, informal practices, educators, learners, and communities. HEPGA therefore encourages us to move beyond isolated explanations and toward a systems perspective. Rather than asking which single factor is responsible for a problem or outcome, HEPGA asks how multiple factors work together to shape educational experiences and decisions. The main takeaway from this slide is simple. Fragmented analysis helps us understand individual pieces. HEPGA helps us understand the connections between those pieces. Now that we have seen the overall purpose of HEPGA, let us look more closely at the components that make up the framework. HEPGA is built around 5 interconnected components that help us understand how educational systems function. These components provide a more comprehensive way of examining policy, governance, and educational practice. The first component is the macro level. This refers to a system-wide policy and governance structure. At this level, governments, ministries, boards, and senior leaders establish priorities, allocate resources, develop regulations, and provide strategic direction. Macro-level decisions often shape what is possible throughout the rest of the system. The second component is the meso-level. The meso-level sits between policy creation and policy enactment. It includes actors such as policy leaders, department heads, program coordinators, and administrators. Their role is to interpret, coordinate, translate, and adapt policy so that it can be implemented within specific organizational contexts. The third component is the micro level. This is where policy is experienced in everyday practice. Teachers, students, staff members, families, and communities interact with policies in real educational settings. The micro level reminds us that policies do not simply exist on paper. They are lived, interpreted, negotiated, and enacted through daily practice. The fourth component is culture. Culture includes the values, beliefs, norms, traditions, and assumptions that shape how people think and act within educational settings. Even when two organizations operate under the same policy, differences in culture can produce very different outcomes. Culture, therefore, influences how policies are interpreted, accepted, resisted, or modified. The fifth component is shadow policy. These are the informal rules, unwritten expectations, routines, and practices that influence decision-making but may not appear in official policy documents. Shadow policies often emerge through experience, relationships, local traditions, and organizational habits. In many situations, they can have just as much influence as formal policies. What makes HEPGA distinctive is that it brings all 5 of these components into a single analytical framework. Rather than treating policy, governance, culture, and informal practices as separate topics, HEPGA views them as interconnected elements that collectively shape educational systems. So far, we've introduced the components of HEPGA. The next question is, how do we use these components to understand educational systems? This is where HEPGA functions as a system lens. Rather than examining educational issues as isolated events, HEPGA encourages us to see them as part of a larger system of interconnected relationships. At the center of this slide is the educational system. Surrounding it are the 5 components of HEPGA. What is important here is not the components themselves, but the connections between them. The arrows represent influence flowing in multiple directions. Policy decisions made at the macro level influence organizational practices at the meso level and everyday experiences at the micro level. At the same time, classroom realities, community experiences, and local innovations can influence leaders, organizations, and eventually broader policy discussions. Culture also shapes how people interpret policies and governance structures. Similarly, shadow policies and informal practices can influence what actually happens in educational systems, regardless of what formal policies may intend. A system lens reminds us that educational outcomes rarely have a single cause. When a challenge emerges in a school, university, or educational program, the explanation is often found in the interaction of multiple factors rather than in one policy, one leader, or one decision. This perspective helps us move beyond symptoms and toward understanding underlying assumptions. Instead of asking which policy caused this outcome, we begin asking how did different policies, government structures, cultures, and practices interact to produce this outcome. Before we conclude this introductory video, let us begin thinking about one of these components in more detail. If HEPGA helps us understand the entire system, where did the system itself receive its directions, priorities, authorities, and resources from? To answer that question, we turn first to the macro level of policy and governance, the focus of our next video.